Hello, everyone. Welcome to an all new episode of the Indic Paradigm. Please do like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. Today, we have a very interesting guest on our show, new celebrity of the sorts in the block, a comparative sociologist. He wears a lot of other hats as well. In the day, he's a comparative sociologist. In the evening, he's a Khan market gangster, a citizen of Lutyens, Delhi. Great to have you on the show, Salvatore.
Thanks for featuring me. Much appreciated.
Yeah. So, firstly, I want to ask you, of all the countries in the world, because you're a comparative sociologist, you're not essentially an expert on any one country. How did you decide to deep dive on India?
India is an exceptional case. Now, it's often said that India is the world's largest democracy. From a social science standpoint, that's completely irrelevant. There are big democracies, small democracies, from the US down to Liechtenstein, and democracy is unrelated to country size. The much more interesting fact is that India is by far the world's poorest democracy. And what led me to study India was the question, how can democracy work in a poor country? Now, you may think there are other poor countries that are democracies, but when you look around the world, if you use a simple test, has a country had free and fair elections with routine transfer of power from one party to another for at least 3 decades? I mean, that's not asking much. 3 decades only brings us back to 1992. India, I believe, is the only poor country, the only country with a GDP per capita of less than, about $10,000 per capita that has maintained a democracy for even as long as 3 decades. Now, of course, India's democracy goes back 75 years. We could debate the emergency and to what extent that might represent a discontinuity in Indian democracy. But, fundamentally, India is the only poor country democratic success story in the world. And in fact, when I say poor, I'm using that test less than $10,000 GDP per capita. Even at that level, we only have countries in Eastern Europe that frankly had to become democracies in order to qualify for European Union membership. So are they really indigenously developed democracies? It's impossible to say. Now, they may be, they may not. We don't know what would have happened to them had the carrot of European Union membership not been dangled in front of them. So we might be looking at $30,000 a year at places like Taiwan and South Korea as being, the poorest countries in the world that have developed and maintained their own democracy through their own resources and their own institutions without any meaningful outside interference. Now, by that metric, India is by a factor of 10 or 15 the poorest, successful, well-institutionalized democracy in the world. And it's that exceptional nature of Indian democracy that led me to study it. And I have been studying it intensively for the last 3 years. But it's what led me to study India as an important and instructive case for the rest of the world.
So what exactly did you see, and what were some facts which you found in contrast to reality?
Look, I'm a social scientist, not a journalist. And so I don't work with anecdote and personal stories or experiences. I was in a taxi and the taxi driver told me this, or I was on the metro and I saw that. I work with documents and data. So the first key documents that differentiate Indian democracy are the independence era literature. And I started my own reading of the independence literature. Personally, I started with Swami Vivekananda. I know you could go earlier than Vivekananda. I know you could have started later than that. I started with Vivekananda and then worked my way forward. Now, India has a democracy literature of people writing about what they wanted for Indian democracy and for their new nation that they fully expected to be born. India's volume of democracy literature is larger, I think, than that of any other country in the world. The only comparable country is my own country, the United States. Now, I live in Australia, but I am American, and people are very familiar with this American literature, the Federalist Papers, the Anti-Federalist Papers, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson, writing articles, discussing with each other and disagreeing with each other about what shape democracy should take, trying to argue about the form of institutions. Well, that hasn't happened in a lot of countries. I mean, the French Constitution was just given to France by de Gaulle. for example. England has a long history, but England has a long history not so much as a democracy. So its democracy emerged slowly out of its monarchy without any one period in which there's a literature at which people said this is what democracy should look like. Now, among those American founding fathers, the only one who really wrote a book was John Adams, who wrote a full-size book on the American constitutions, not just the U.S. Constitution, but the state constitutions in the United States. And thinking about models of constitutions, both from the U.S. states and from European countries for the American Constitution. All the rest are pamphlets. If you contrast that with India, almost all of India's founding fathers, maybe the big exception is Sardar Patel, everyone else wrote at least one book. Many of them wrote several books expressing a vision for an Indian nation and an Indian democracy. Now, personally, I think that's what's been distinctive about Indian democracy. It emerged from a process of discussion, dialogue, and compromise. There are a lot of messy features of Indian democracy that aren't, in the French sense, analytical. Right? They are not, the Indian democracy is not well theorized. It is well debated. And so a lot of features of Indian democracy are compromises. Just as in the American Constitution, we have compromises that are now seen as outdated and embarrassing. So the 3/5 clause in America, meaning that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of determining the number of representatives in Congress. Well, that's so wrong on so many levels, right? It's wrong for admitting slavery. It's wrong for counting a slave as 3/5 of a person. But if a slave had been counted as a full person, then it would have wrongly given representation to states that kept people in chains, right? So it was a difficult and messy compromise. Now, those sort of compromises are what made the American Constitution so robust. It may not be a constitution that you can point to everything and say, that was morally right. But it is a constitution that has, largely speaking, worked with one major crisis in the 1860s. It's worked for almost 250 years now. In the same way, the Indian Constitution, while it has problems, while individual people can point to things and say, that element is unjust or that element is wrong and should be reversed, as the result of a compromise among all the factions of society who had a say. All the major political groups in India had input into what ultimately became the Indian Constitution and the foundations of Indian democracy. I think that's a large part of the reason why Indian democracy has proven so stable, in that it is well suited to India in a way that other constitutions that have simply been promulgated without any real debate in society maybe have failed because they're not organically rooted in the societies from which they've emerged.
That's a very interesting point you make, and I think that enough credit is actually never given. Usually it's considered as a product of the British Raj, right? And that I find quite interesting that, because not just before independence, in fact, even after independence, our leaders like Rajaji, Nehru, etc., constantly on debate. Like, for example, if you see our neighborhood, there have been military coups so many times. But the fact that it's never happened in India was not just a coincidence. They spent a lot of hours discussing how we should ensure that the separation of powers exists and such a situation never comes in. I mean, it's sometimes we think certain things are so organic, but they actually had a lot of
India
method.
absolutely did not obtain its democratic institutions from the UK. First, the UK was not really democratic, up until only about 20 years before India's independence. But more importantly, Pakistan was carved out of the British Raj. Myanmar was carved out of British India. Sri Lanka was not exactly British India, but was a crown colony. Bangladesh is a heritage of British India. And then you have all the British East African territories, the British South African territories. None of them have the same record of democracy. Yeah. So, there are certain continuities, but all of these countries inherited a British penal code, for example. All these countries inherited a British civil code. It's what you did with it that makes the difference between Indian democracy and other countries' political systems.
Correct. So I want to come to the point which a lot of people have been asking you. what was your point of contention with Shekhar Gupta and
Look,
Rajdeep
I have no point of
Sardesai?
contention with either of them. So some people want to see it as some kind of battle. To me, that's just laughable. Both of them have been incredibly supportive. Both of them have criticized me at points. I would criticize them at points. I mean, Rajdeep criticized me in a video after his India Today interview with me. The India Today interview with me, he was entirely supportive. I mean, he was trying to bring out my views. He was a first-class interviewer. In his later personal video that he did on his YouTube channel, he was critical, saying that, that I was a Trumpian and, maybe didn't share his values. Well, I don't know what Rajdeep's politics are, so I don't know if I share his values. Am I a Trumpian? Well, I'm very proud of the fact that I wrote a book during the Trump era, published in 2018, called The New Authoritarianism, Trump Populism, and the Tyranny of Experts. And I'm very proud of the fact that that book was named Best on Politics 2018 by the Wall Street Journal by a reviewer who said, in 2018, in the midst of Trump madness, the reviewer said, I can't tell what Salvatore Babones' politics are. But if you can't tell someone's politics in a Trump book in 2018, all right, I'm doing something right. So I'm very proud of that fact. Now, I am not a Trump condemner. And I think because I've not condemned Donald Trump, I'm viewed as a Trumpian. Look, I think there was a lot of good in Trump. I especially think, and here's a very subtle point for you, Trump was very good for American democracy. Not Trump was a great Democrat. Trump was good for American democracy, because what American democracy needed was to be re-energized, to have a new wave, to drain the swamp, as Trump liked to say, and to have a new wave of people being brought into the democratic system. And if you think that voter turnout is a healthy indication of a healthy democracy, American voter turnout has been hitting records not seen in more than a century ever since Trump came on the scene. So, I'm happy to stand by everything I've said about Trump. Now, Shekhar Gupta in the print identified me as a foreign agent. That was very amusing because, of course, if you read the article, now the print's headline was clickbait. The Salvatore Babones quote unquote foreign agent. Now, the headline was clickbait, but if you read the article, it was a perfectly factual article. I have registered as a foreign agent. Now, foreign agent just means I work as a consultant for a foreign principal, and that's perfectly ordinary, right? There's nothing wrong with working for a foreign principal. It's all disclosed. If I were doing anything nefarious, I wouldn't have disclosed it. I think most people who are involved in shadowy work like that don't disclose it. My attitude was, look, I want to be as above board as possible. So I did a consulting assignment for an Indian firm. That consulting assignment was related to journalism, and erring on the side of caution, I said, you know what? If it's related to journalism, I should declare it, instead of potentially construing it that, well, it's not necessarily declarable. And in fact, the Australian authorities asked me, they called me and they said, we don't want you to declare this, because they were worried that too many people were declaring too much, and they didn't want it, they didn't want everybody to be dumping everything in the foreign influence registry. And so they literally called me, set up a phone call, said, we don't think what you're doing should be registered. I said, is there any penalty for registering frivolously? They said, no. I said, is there any penalty for not registering? They said, well, yes, you could have your visa revoked and be ejected from the country. I said, well, I'm going to register, right? I mean, and so it was a big nothing burger. But look, Shekhar invited me into the print offices. I had a great time there. I mean, there's no ill will, certainly not on my side, for either Rajdeep or Shekhar. I respect both of them immensely.
Right. So, Salvatore, coming to the write-up that you wrote on, you put the blame of, the problems of Indian coverage outside India squarely at the hands of Indian intellectuals, right? The Khan Market gang. By the way, it was a great picture gang of you strutting around in the Khan Market as well. Yes. So, So I have a point that I want to ask you here. Somehow I feel that it's a co-created situation. It's not just Indian intellectuals. It's also the Western intelligentsia in collusion with Indian intellectuals who are to be blamed. So I want to ask you, why do you not see any problem?
There are problems in Western views of India, but the problems are not with the rankings agencies as such. They are accurately communicating, and I really want to emphasize this, they are accurately reflecting the views on Indian democracy of leading Indian intellectuals. Now, when I say intellectuals, I mean people who have institutional positions as intellectuals, deans of faculties of political science and political sociology, top human rights activists, writers who are invited to headline writing festivals, right? The very top elite Indian intellectuals, the Rajdeep Sardesais of the world, right? Who are, top journalists who have millions of followers. Okay. This intellectual class in India seems to have an appraisal of Indian democracy under Narendra Modi that before 2014, Indian democracy was doing quite well. And now it has been dramatically eroded. And that view of Indian democracy has been reflected in the rankings. Now, why do I let Western intellectuals off the hook? Because there are only a small number of Western intellectuals who take this viewpoint. Now, there are a small number. I can think of, 4 or 5 in my own head. But it's a relatively small number. It's a small fraternity. And if they have that view, it's largely because their friends and colleagues in India have that view. That is, I don't think the Western intellectuals who spend a lifetime studying India are coming to India, de novo as a blank slate approach to India. They're talking to Indian intellectuals. They're getting their viewpoint. I mean, after all, how do we know about the world? There's no documentary evidence of backsliding in Indian democracy. So why are the Western intellectuals so convinced that India has become a neo-fascist Hindutva religious dictatorship? Well, they're convinced because that's what their friends tell them, right? I mean, the Western intellectuals are not experiencing this themselves. They're not voting in India. They're not, many of them are not living in India. They don't have the experience of being Indian. They're not working off documents because when I ask for documentary evidence, like in the rankings, I went through all of the documentary evidence, literally all of it, provided in support of the rankings. The documentary evidence is not there. So where are Western intellectuals getting this idea from? I'm afraid to say they almost certainly are getting it from their own friends who are themselves Indian intellectuals. And I've heard this. Look, again, I don't want to name names. I've heard 2 past presidents of academic associations from India speaking here in Australia say that India was now a fascist country. Now, if the president of an Indian academic society tells us, Western intellectuals, that India is a fascist country, and these are people who've been elected by their peers to be head of the Indian Political Science Association, head of the Indian Sociological Association, why should we doubt them? Right? I mean, in order to doubt them, we would have to go do lots of independent work to form our own opinions. So yeah, are there problems with Western intellectuals? Yes, absolutely. Are there a small number of Western intellectuals who are responsible for spreading, I think, mendacious information about India? Yeah, there are. But if Indian intellectuals weren't also doing it, no one would be listening.
Okay. Because, I know that there's been a well-entrenched system for so many years, the, left liberal intellectual class. But I also see a very strong emergence of the non-left in the intelligentsia, whether
Sure.
It's the literary festival circuit, whether it is prominent academic journals. So things have changed, but, I'll give you so for example, certain intellectuals like Audrey Truschke, right? I mean, they probably had those views anyways.
Right.
It's probably not an Indian intellectual, right? And the kind of people who enter this ecosystem, like, for example, it's essentially at 2 levels. One is the intellectual class, the academia, as well as the media, right? For example, you would know about this New York Times India desk, hiring memo, which talked about somebody who is opposed to a certain ideology will only be hired. So if the filtration process is, you know what I mean?
I think it has been misunderstood by people in India. I don't have the text in front of me. If you do, you can read it, and I can explain to you why I dismissed it when it was put to me as evidence. Look, I think it's just a poorly written memo that they simply wanted to promote fearless reporting, quote unquote. And if it were in the US, it would have just been, there's that sort of language in the US, we would have shrugged our shoulders and said, of course, that's what they want. But of course, take it out of context and write it in an Indian context. It sounds damning. I don't think that memo really was evidence of much in particular. But when I talk about intellectuals, I want to be clear. I'm talking about people whose job it is to be intellectuals. So Audrey Truschke has a position, a paid position as an academic at a major U.S. university. Admittedly, she's at a branch campus. She's not at Stanford. She's not a Blom-Hansen, or something like that. But, she's at a research university in the U.S. She's an award-winning author of, Histories of India, who's won an award from the American Historical Association. So, she is a credentialed intellectual. If you compare her, for example, with a Jesai Deepak, Jesai Deepak, I know, has become wildly popular in India with his India That Is Bharat books. I'm reading the first book. I'll be starting it in a few weeks. It's on my reading list. I own it already. All right. He's very smart. He's very knowledgeable, but he's a lawyer. Right? He is not professionally an intellectual in the sense that we mean, someone who studies India for a living, paid by a university or by a think tank to have this role. So these establishment intellectuals are really who's driving the narrative on international rankings. And they're who should drive the ranking. If you wanted to know, let's just take this out of the realm of democracy. If you wanted to know what is the global consensus on climate change. Now, a lot of us believe that the global consensus on climate change is, really mendacious in many ways, and that the truth is not being told, and that there are a lot of reasons to doubt the consensus that's being presented to us. However, who are you going to ask? Are you going to ask the outsider intellectual who writes a book saying, climate change myth, and sells 100,000 copies? Or are you going to trust the professor at a major university who's a professor of geosciences? Ultimately, any ranking system has to be based on those credentialed professors who are studying the area, even if they're wrong. I'm not defending them as being right. I'm defending the ranking systems for relying on their opinions, because these are the credentialed intellectuals on whose opinions they have to rely. Once they open it up to anyone who's had a successful book, well, there are all sorts of crazy people with successful books. It doesn't make them credentialed intellectuals.
Right. I think that's the whole thing, right? To build a credentials-based ecosystem is how we can probably create societal influence with some legitimacy. So, yeah. So I want to ask you here a couple of statistics, like especially that you mentioned on media freedoms and India being rated below Hong Kong. And I think certain rankings where India is below Afghanistan as well in certain places. And I shared with you an example of how in 2008, when homosexuality was a crime in India, it was a much better land for homosexuals than today when it has been legalized.
Well, but so, you say that, but I don't... But as an academic, and I want to stress, I'm an academic. I'm not trying to promote any one or other political point of view. As an academic, the mere fact that homosexuality was technically illegal and is now technically legal really says nothing to me about whether or not people who are homosexual are persecuted in society. I'm not saying it is the case. I'm saying as an academic who needs evidence, it could be the case that this British era law was never enforced, and before 2014, homosexuals were welcomed at the highest levels and had access equal to that of heterosexual citizens of India. And it could be the case that since 2014, despite the legalization of homosexuality, homosexuals have been systematically shunned by officials in power who have repeatedly made homophobic comments in an attempt to vilify homosexuals. So, prima facie, the fact that law was changed is not evidence to me. Now, I'd like to see the evidence. If someone is going to say that homosexual rights in India have come under attack in the last 8 years, show me some evidence, right? So I'd like to see the evidence of that. If it's a mere claim, as it seems to be in the Varieties of Democracy Institute evaluation of homosexual rights in India, if it's a mere claim, then I'm very skeptical because I see all of these claims. I see India's evaluation on the Varieties of Democracy Institute surveys falling on every metric simultaneously. Well, then I start to think that's a bias. That's not an evidence-based judgment. But I can't know that. And if anyone out there who does study homosexual rights in India has systematically compiled evidence of homosexual rights and whether they've improved or deteriorated, let's get that into the debate. But although it sounds cute and although it makes a great tweet, and it does make a great tweet, the mere fact of changing the law is, in itself, only one small piece of evidence. We need a lot more in order to make a really accurate judgment.
Got it. In one of the interviews I saw, you mentioned that India should not seek to be a veto-carrying member of the UN Security Council. Maybe a permanent member, but not a vetoing permanent
should
member.
Is
Why
probably
do you
too
say
strong
that?
a word. And if I said should, I should take it back. I don't think it would be good for India to do so. Look, the Security Council gets wrapped up in emotions because, everyone thinks, like, why should these 5 countries lord it over the rest of the world just because they won World War II 80 years ago? And the answer is that the Security Council very quickly transformed after 1945 from a council of victors into a council of countries that if something went wrong, they might accidentally destroy the entire world. Now, just by coincidence, the 5 countries that were on the council in 1945 ended up later, after Taiwan was ejected and China joined the council. So after 1972, I think, I forget when China joined the Security Council. After that point, these became the 5 countries that we had to worry if they accidentally go to war with each other, we could face nuclear Armageddon. So, for example, there's a lot of nervousness right now about Ukraine because if something goes wrong with NATO pushing its support for Ukraine while Russia pushing its aggression against Ukraine, we could have some misunderstanding, something goes wrong, and an exchange occurs that escalates into a nuclear Armageddon. Well, that's why we need these 2 countries, the US and Russia, to have a veto on the United Nations. Similarly, France is very active in overseas peacekeeping, not just peacekeeping, but actual conflict work in Africa. There are French troops all over Africa engaging in actual conflict. Again, what if French troops come into conflict with Chinese troops? I mean, China now increasingly participates in politics in Africa. There's a Chinese base in Djibouti. China is very active in the African Union. So, if I envisage a problem where Chinese and African troops accidentally shoot at each other, and then there's an exchange of, more conflict, things happen, someone gets killed, I want to be careful, right? So China has to be in the Security Council. France has to be in the Security Council. Again, the UK just ran an aircraft carrier through the Taiwan Strait. Well, what if a Chinese ship had rammed that aircraft carrier? Again, these are countries that are aggressively participating in overseas missions. Not just peacekeeping at the UN where all they have is sidearms, but aggressive overseas missions with real weapons. We need them to have this veto power on the UN because we can't have them we can't have the UN Security Council ganging up to condemn Russia. And then Russia decides, well, we're going to launch a nuclear strike. It's the only way, we can retain our national honor, right? This is what we have to prevent. Now, India has consistently been a force for peace. India intervened in Sri Lanka at the invitation of the Sri Lankan government. India intervened in Bangladesh to prevent an even worse genocide than what happened in Bangladesh. But India has been very circumspect in its use of military force. It hasn't used military force in an offensive way in decades. It shows no signs of being interested in meddling in Africa, of sending a fleet to the South China Sea, of potentially blowing up a natural gas pipeline, somewhere else in the world. Like, these just aren't things India is likely to do. So if India were added on as a permanent member of the Security Council, it would just add baggage to the Security Council. It would diminish that important role the Security Council has. And I think people who think the UN is irrelevant, yeah, the UN is irrelevant. The Security Council, though, someone has prevented nuclear war now for 75 years. And I think the Security Council, its number one overriding must-do mission is prevent nuclear war. Maybe you need a South Asian Council with India and Pakistan on it. Fine. But unless India is going to start being an interventionist power, sending troops all around the world, it would just clutter the Security Council to add India, to add Brazil. There would be demands, why isn't there an African country in the Security Council? Okay, South Africa should be on it. Then we would have the question, is India on the Security Council representing India, or is it on the Security Council representing all of South Asia? In which case, it just becomes a huge mess. And the Security Council would no longer perform this incredibly important role. So I know that's a very long answer. I know it's an answer that's not satisfying to Indians who, as a matter of national pride, think that being on the Security Council means you're one of the big boys or something like that. Look, being on the Security Council means you're preventing nuclear Armageddon. And that's a role for these 5 countries that are the ones who are likely to bring us to nuclear Armageddon. They're the ones who have to be talking there. And crucially, to be able to veto any military intervention that one of the other countries proposes to make.
Interesting. And in those lines, since we are talking about the UN off late, there's been a lot of discussion on India importing Russian oil. Yeah. Although I'm sure you would have heard Indian Foreign Minister Jai Shankar talk about we import far less than what Germany does even today, right? The whole coverage around that. But coming back, do you Indians really have a lot of issue in terms of how this, how their country is covered in the West? And the reverse would not be true, right? If there is a critique of the United States or Australia or the UK in India, right? I don't think, people wouldn't care. Why do you think Indians are so bothered by Western validation, or do you think it really carries the weight in terms of their, their image in the world? Do you think it really impacts?
Well, to some extent, there's what Australians call a cultural cringe. This seeking validation from countries that are seen as role models or that are more developed, that are richer, that have higher prestige. And to some degree, that's true. And let's just be honest about it. But to some degree, it's practical in that Western coverage of India has the potential to affect India in ways that Indian coverage of the United States, for example, has very little possibility to affect the United States. In democracies especially, the U.S. is, for whatever everyone may have heard about democracy in danger in the U.S. or democracy being over, the U.S. is a very competitively democratic country. And in that competitive democracy, small shifts in coverage, small shifts in narrative can have big impacts on the rest of the world. Now, I'll give you an example close to home for India. It's not India, it's close to India. Look at what's happened to the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, Afghanistan, like other countries, kept foreign currency reserves on deposit with the New York Federal Reserve Bank. That should have been inviolate. Doesn't matter who controls Afghanistan. They're the sovereign reserves of Afghanistan, not the political reserves of the people who happen to run Afghanistan. Okay. But the U.S. Congress and the U.S. president felt that it would be embarrassing if they, because the U.S. was thoroughly opposed to the Taliban regime. So what if they let the Taliban regime have its reserves, which are its reserves? They're not the U.S. reserves. They're Afghanistan's reserves. What if they pull the reserves out and then use them to repress women in Afghanistan? And then, of course, in U.S. domestic politics, Joe Biden would be the president who gave the Taliban $30 billion to, to repress women. So U.S. politics played out in the freezing of Afghan reserves, which ultimately resulted in the deaths of we don't know how many, in the suffering of we don't know how many Afghans from hunger, because Afghanistan was not able to fulfill its import needs for food, medicine, and oil. All right, so that's an extreme example that U.S. domestic politics determine the fate of several million people in Afghanistan, purely on the basis of it would look bad for President Biden. And it's not just that it's Democrats. If a Republican had been in charge, he would have done the same thing. It would look bad for the president to give money, big air quotes, give money to the Taliban. Now, India faces the same sort of problems on a much smaller scale. So India is right now doing a competition for carrier-borne aircraft. And, the U.S. F-18 is in the running and the French, Rafale's in the running. Well, that requires lots of export licenses. Or for that matter, the Indian indigenous Tejas fighter uses General Electric engines. Requires an export license. Now, what if India has its own indigenous Tejas program, has several hundred Tejas fighters flying, and some congressperson in the U.S. floats a bill holding a stack of official reports from Freedom House, The Economist, Variety of the Democracy Institute, Washington Post, and New York Times, saying that India has descended into fascism. And this congressperson says, how can we sell sensitive defense technology to a fascist regime? And of course, no other congressperson wants to be seen as fascist. We could see India's exports license revoked because, the narrative is that India is a fascist regime that should not be provided with these export licenses. Now, that's an extreme example, but again, it's within the realm of possibility. Let me, though, give you examples that are happening right now. VDEM, its official VDEM's evaluations of Indian democracy feed into governance indices produced by U.S. Agency for International Development, produced by the World Bank. They are subcomponents of those governance indices consist of evaluations from VDEM, Variety of Democracy Institute, which ultimately come from their panel of experts, which ultimately comes from mainly Indian intellectuals. Well, those governance indices are then used as indicators or as variables in sovereign debt rating. And so when Moody's, Standard & Poor's, Fitch rate sovereign debt, they have a statistical model. And one of the variables in that statistical model, I guarantee you, as a statistician, I guarantee you one of the variables is level of governance. Now, if India scores work, its level of governance will be correlated with sovereign risk. Countries that have low governance will have high sovereign risk. Countries that have high governance will have low sovereign risk. Well, India is right now paying some, I guarantee you, paying some minor percentage point higher on its sovereign debt because its rating is just slightly lower because those governance indices are feeding into models that rate India's sovereign debt. Okay, so it's a drag on the Indian economy. Now, just like with Israel faces all these sort of pressures at an even higher level. Can India still succeed despite this? Yeah, sure. Will India always be fighting against the current and succeeding less than it otherwise would? Unfortunately, yes. And that's why people should really be concerned about these.
I also wonder sometimes these, the rankings and as well as the media coverage that happens on India in the Western world. How much do you think this would impact people-to-people contact as well? Not just with Indians and people in the Western countries, but also in terms of the diaspora. Because if you see the recent incidences, whether it was Leicester, whether it's the Khalistani protests, Canada, the stuff that, in the United States as well, a lot of incidents of violences, events like dismantling Hindutva happening and the raking up of caste in IT companies, so many other things, right? Like, do you think somewhere all of this has origins in the academia, and do you think this impacts people-to-people contact?
Again, here I'm going to get into anecdote because I don't have data, and this is not my specialty. But I was talking to an Indian American this morning who said that his kids at school were ashamed or afraid to say they were Hindu because people said that Hindus are racists. Now, that narrative that Hindus are racists, that Hindus are anti-Muslim, That narrative has been spread by prestigious institutions, by people. I mean, if you read Rajiv Malhotra's book on it, Snakes in the Ganga, Harvard has been really at this, not the entire university, but people in certain departments at Harvard University have been very instrumental. And these people, like we mentioned Trusky, we might mention Thomas Blum Hansen at Stanford University, the professor of South Asian Studies, who routinely calls India. I don't know if he uses the word fascist or not, but he routinely calls India a non-democratic country and a racist country. Well, it's no surprise that this comes down and ultimately affects even children. Now, at this point, it's incipient. I don't think this is widespread yet. But the kind of incidents we've seen, like the Leicester incidents, which initially the British press and the British press initially reported as Hindu nationalist violence, despite the fact that once the evidence came out, there was no evidence of Hindu nationalist violence. The worst allegation I've seen against Hindus in Leicester was that they played music. And, while that may be annoying, people might not like it, playing music is not quite the same as the allegations, which were that they abducted young girls, which was reported in the British press until the Leicester police issued a denial saying, no, this hasn't happened, right? So this sort of malicious maligning of Hindus in the diaspora is only beginning. And my strong instinct is it's going to get worse because those who are doing it are well funded, they're well organized, they are many of them literally the same people who have for decades been fostering anti-Semitic activism in the US, UK, Canada, Australia. Well, now they're shifting over to anti-Hindu rhetoric in these countries. They're well practiced at it, and unfortunately, they have in many cases the support of leading institutions like universities instead of having to face resistance from leading institutions like universities. So yeah, it's a problem. It's going to get worse. But here I'm not speaking as an expert on it. I'm speaking as a sociologist making a general observation on things that just seem obvious to me from having watched other people suffer the same problems.
It's a very interesting word that you used, nationalism, right? Because that word means something very different in the West and in India. Probably the way in which Indians use that word can be translated as some form of patriotism, right? In the Western world, it would probably not be defined understood by the same word, the meaning. And the other thing I want you to chime in on is that nation-state based nationalism seems to be the way in which the Western world understands, right? Like any form of the national identity of any country, the national character. But in India, and you would have heard this word very often since you're reading Sai Deepak as well, it's considered as civilizational nationalism. Now that is a little metaphysical and esoteric. It's not, you know what I mean?
The civilization state concept is very popular, especially among young Indians, especially as a new alternative to people who've grown up with adults telling them that nationalism is bad. They can now say, no, we're not nationalists, we're civilizationalists. Look, all of this is a tempest in a teacup. Remember, the Indian National Congress has always described itself as a nationalist party. Nationalism used to be considered a reform movement in the West. That is, nationalism used to be associated with liberalism. Right. So the great nationalist revolts of the 1848 have been romanticized in the West as great liberal revolts. Exactly. So words are always changing their valence as someone wants to attack someone else. Really, I mean, the Germans, the Nazis called themselves National Socialists. And so you better not call your party national and socialist. You can be socialist, you can be national, but the Congress Party in India is a national socialist party. Now they're not Nazis. Right. But you can't use those words because those words mean not. So look, this wordism, if you will, I really just don't take. very seriously. And forgive me, the whole civilization state concept is just a way to get around. I don't want to diminish the serious intellectual caliber of the people behind it, but it's just a way to get around the word nation state, because nationalism now sounds like a dirty word. Ultimately, other nation states also think of themselves as civilizations and in civilizational terms. The Indian scholars talking about civilization state may not think so, but the scholars in Poland think of Polish civilization, not that they're just part of Christian civilization. The French nationalist scholars think of themselves as the center of French civilization, not as a French nation within a Christian civilization. I mean, these words, because we have the idea of civilization good, nation bad, everyone wants to attach the label civilization to themselves. As someone who has extensively studied nation and civilization and the use of these words in history, I just chuckle at all of it. I don't think there's a lot of analytical distinction being made here. We can quibble over details, and I'm sure that if you got J. Deepak on and for a debate, he would quibble over a lot of details. He's a lawyer. Quibbling over details is what he does. But as from a broad perspective, there's nothing there. Nationalism is not a bad thing. It can be used as a bad thing. Liberals like to label nationalism as bad. Well, just 50, 60 years ago, liberals were labeling nationalism as good. I guarantee you,
they were the nationalists.
As people continue to use this civilization state concept, 10, 20 years from, maybe not even 10, maybe 2, 3 years from now, people who are opposed to this form of scholarship will start telling you that civilization is a dirty word. In fact, there's a strong tradition in the West of thinking of civilization as a dirty word. You may have heard of Kenneth Clark's famous series Civilization for the BBC from the 1960s or 70s. Well, now if you talk about Western civilization, you'll get a chorus of condemnation in Australia. In fact, we had a debate over Western Civ in Australia. I was part of that debate, saying everyone's being ridiculous. Of course it's fine to talk about Western civilization, but the anti-civilizationists equated civilization with racism. And all that'll happen from this new debate over a civilization state is that people will say, how dare you include Nepal and Sri Lanka in India's civilization? That's racist. That's diminishing the agency of others. I mean, you'll get the same sort of complaints as you get now against calling yourself a nationalist. It's six of one, half dozen of another.
So, see, here is where. So I might differ from you in this, in the sense that in a nation state, you kind of define yourself from when that constitution was formed or when the nation was formed. But when you're talking about a civilization,
not the country.
Yeah, exactly. When you have a certain,
when the state was formed. Read Savarkar. Savarkar doesn't say India is not a nation yet because we don't have a constitution yet. Right? Okay.
Exactly. What I'm trying to say is, if you use this narrative of a civilizational state, then the Republic of India is just a blip in the timeline.
And if you use the word nation state, the Republic of India is a blip in the history of the Indian nation. It's the same thing. I mean, again, read other nationalisms.
Because I'll tell you why. Because a lot of people say India is a modern construct. I'm sure you would have heard this. 1947 is when India was born. I mean,
I'm saying changing the word. Changing the word won't help you.
It's basically
because the concept is fundamentally the same. I mean, all nationalisms. I say this advisedly. Harken back to some proto nation that has existed since time immemorial. Thus, in Russia, the Russia invasion of Ukraine being justified on the idea that the Russian nation was founded in Kievan Rus, and that Kiev is the historical capital of, not of the Russian civilization, of the Russian nation. A nation defined as a people who have been together throughout history. This trope is everywhere. And look, it's equally false and equally true everywhere. And if you are serious about the idea of a civilization state, I mean, if you're really serious, and I'm going to take you at your word, Well, then, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Pakistan are part of Indian civilization. There's as a civilization, not as a okay, they're part of Indian civilization.
Yes. Yes.
Arguably, Tibet is part of the broad Indian civilization. Southeast Asia, Cambodia and Angkor Wat, part of the Indian civilization. So if that's the case, what makes India, the state that has some kind of ownership of this civilization? I mean, I can make all sorts of anti-civilization state arguments saying that it's an imperialist construct. I could say you're an imperialist for insisting that India controls this civilization when, Sri Lankans and Nepalese people, they have agency of their own. And, how dare you appropriate this Indic civilization for yourself, right? So we could get into all the same silly arguments if you call it a civilization state, as we do now calling it a nation state.
Let me just mention 2 or 3 points. Number one, Tibet and probably even Nepal would be considered as the fringes of the Indian civilization, not the core.
Yeah.
So it is part of it, but it's still the fringes. Second, Southeast Asia is like an outpost of Indian civilization. So there is a clear distinction between India, which is Bharatvarsha, versus Suvarnadeepa, which is Southeast Asia, even if they have common similarities. The other thing, this is a very interesting point you made, because of how the word civilization is perceived in Australia and the Western world. See, because Western countries have been colonialists, there has been this thing of we are civilized and we will come and reform the savages. But that has not ever been the thing with Indian kingdoms or civilization at all. So that is a lens that doesn't hold true at all. We've never had this thing that we will come and reform someone else or impose ourselves on someone else, right? In a way, India has historically been non-aligned in that sense that we don't cross our borders anyways.
But let me challenge you. You're willing to give up Nepal and Tibet as being the fringes. You willing to give up Sikkim? Is that part of the fringes and not part of the heart of Indian civilization? Are you willing to give up Arunachal Pradesh? You willing to give up Kashmir? Are you willing to give up the Northeast, not being part of the heart of Indic civilization? Right. So then if we're going to hold you to what you're saying about Nepal, well, then you have to give up 4 or 5 states of India as not being part of Indian civilization state, right? So, and if you're not willing, if you insist, no, Arunachal Pradesh is part of the heart of Indian civilization. Oh, no, but Nepal, that's not, right? No, we all know that Arunachal Pradesh is in India and Nepal is outside India because of an accident of British colonialism. And had the British established firm control over Nepal, Nepal would right now be in a state of India. Now, Nepalese people may not like that fact. Indian people may not like that fact, but that's a fact, right? It's purely an accident of the extent of British colonialism that led to Nepal and Bhutan being independent and Sikkim almost ending up independent, but ending up instead inside India, and the Arunachal Pradesh ending up inside India. These are all accidents of the randomness of how map making turned out. So, either way you have it. If you have the big India, you're a colonist. If you have the little India civilization, then you're excluding millions of your compatriots as not being truly Indian. All right. So, let's give it up.
Well, it's the nation state and the boundaries are ever evolving in that sense. But okay, I mean, let's give it up for now. I want to ask you here, India has been facing these challenges, but at the same time, I don't see many of the other Asian powers like China or Japan, or for that matter, even South Korea, face the same challenges in Western academia and the intelligentsia. Why do you think?
Japan comes in for a lot of criticism. First of all, every time there's the issue of the Shinto shrine, so when Japanese prime ministers visit the shrine of the war dead, it comes up. There are a lot of accusations that Japan is an ethno state that excludes minorities. For instance, people of Korean heritage in Japan. So Japan does come in for heat on these things. Japan just doesn't care so much. I think they have the confidence to say, well, say what you want. We're still going our own way and we're still doing what we do. So Japan does come in for criticism, not interestingly from academics. So Japan's criticism mainly comes from human rights organizations. That said, the reason Japan doesn't get hit as badly on the rankings is that Japanese scholars broadly support Japan's position on these issues. Okay. Korean scholars broadly support Korea doesn't have quite this. Let's stick with Japan. Japan has these issues, very similar to India's issues. But Japanese scholars broadly support Japan's national position on the integrity of the Japanese state and Japanese democracy. As a result, when they're surveyed, they give a positive view of Japan. They're not complaining, right, about Japan being oppressive. Now, they used to. I mean, communist scholars in Japan used to vehemently complain about the repression of communism in Japan, but that's an old issue. It's mostly disappeared. So without those complaints, the kind of Western criticisms of Japan, and there are lots of Western criticisms of human rights in Japan, and think of even the whaling fleet, right? Every time Japan sends out a whaling fleet, there are mass protests in the West against Japanese whaling. Well, why shouldn't Japanese people be allowed to eat whale? I mean, they've been eating whale for thousands of years. I mean, what's wrong with it? And bizarrely, we accept that it's okay for an Aboriginal Inuit person or an indigenous Inuit person to eat whale because that's part of their indigenous practice in northern Canada, but it's not okay for Japan, which is not Western, but a modern industrial country, to eat whale. So Japan comes in for a lot of the same heat, but that Western criticism is not supported by or mobilized by Japanese intellectuals. So Japanese opposition parties are not saying, look, there's this Western condemnation of Japan. Let's use it for domestic political advantage. Right. Where in India, it's big news. I mean, these rankings come out. It's big news. Everyone wants to mobilize them for their own advantage. People who are opposed to the government will mobilize it to say, look, it's not just us. Even, in Shekhar Gupta's case, he said, even the Cato Institute, the conservative American think tank, condemns Indian democracy. And to which I had to point out, oh, yeah, and where does Cato get its data? Verizon Democracy Institute, right? So, but people want to use these rankings as bludgeons in domestic politics. And on the other side, people who are on the government side, on the BJP side, want to use their opposition to these rankings to telegraph their nationalism. Well, we're standing up for India when those other people aren't. So, in Japan, it's not become a domestic issue. And so it's not an issue, right? And here I get back repeatedly to the fact that ultimately, it's Indians who are responsible for weaponizing these Western rankings. It's not a Western conspiracy against India. There may be Western biases, just as there are Western biases against Japan. But the Western biases are being leveraged very heavily by Indians themselves. And that's really what's causing the problems.
So what is your solution in terms of, surely we can't rein in the intellectuals, right? So, that itself, that would be another issue altogether.
So the Qin Emperor said, we don't need intellectuals anymore. He dug a big hole, put all the intellectuals in it, and then filled it up with dirt. So I'm not recommending that as a card-carrying intellectual, and I have a card in my wallet that says so. Please don't harm the intellectuals. But my answer is you can't fix it, right? You can't fix it without, I won't even say without. You simply can't fix it. So this is a problem you're going to have to deal with for decades. Now, I think you can offer an alternative narrative. And I keep telling Indians this, that you can't change the narrative. You can offer an alternative. So what I suggest is that people offer the facts. Now, so I repeatedly hear that Kashmir is the most occupied country in the world. Okay, well, that's based on a single report from a think tank estimating the number of troops in Indian Kashmir. In that very same report, they say number of troops in Chinese-occupied Kashmir, unknown. Number of troops in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, unknown. So Indian Kashmir becomes the most occupied territory in the world. Now, how many troops are there? State secret. There are estimates for India. There are no estimates for the others. How many of those troops are engaged in civil enforcement versus how many are engaged in protecting India's frontier? After all, anti-aircraft missiles in Kashmir are not being used to repress the civilian population. Right? So let's get some stats on that. Like, so if the Indian government wants to change the narrative on Kashmir, it can't change those people who are condemning the government, who are supporting Azad Kashmir, who are having rallies. It can't change all that. It can provide a lot of honest data that would then help those who want to have a more accurate view of Kashmir present that accurate view. And at a minimum, if you make it easily accessible and it's firm data and it's honest and it's very detailed, at a minimum, you'll get the mainstream newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post. They'll have that Azad Kashmir quote at the top of their story. And then in paragraph 18, they'll have the data from the Indian government. Right now, that counter narrative isn't even there. So whether it's Kashmir, whether it's press freedom, whether it's the use of sedition charges, whether it's the banning of organizations, it would be great if there were an easily accessible database that had the list of all organizations banned under UAPA and the year they were banned, so that we could know which and the date they were banned. Now, I know that data exists. If you're a forensic scholar, you can go to the, find out this, but how about just having a nice website that lists it all for me? Because the journalist is not going to do the forensic work. The journalist is going to take the word of an activist. The activist says, oh, here's some terrible thing I've claimed. The easy thing to do for a journalist is say, activist says such and such. So give me the data, right? That will at least empower an accurate counter narrative. That's a start.
In Israel, or for that matter, even the United States, political parties across the aisle might have differences, right? But when it comes to larger geopolitical issues in the United States, whether it's the Republicans or Democrats, or when it comes to even in Israel, whenever there is a strike or something like that, they would never question, like the differences would not go into certain areas which are of a national consensus. Yet here in India, those differences manifest in very ugly. Why? I mean, all of these countries are multipolar democratic countries with opposite ideologies. Why is it in India there is no such national consensus on such issues?
Because probably, I don't know, I don't follow Indian international affairs discourses very much. But I think if you were to ask, does India pull together on international affairs? That is, do Indians across the spectrum have the same view on Chinese aggression? Yeah, there's probably a lot of consensus among all parties opposed to Chinese aggression. Are all parties opposed to Pakistani support for terrorism in India outside Kashmir? So in the rest of it, yeah, everyone condemns Pakistani support for terrorism. There are issues over Kashmir, but